The crash was so loud it could be heard from the other end of the street. People ran out of their homes, startled. Neighbors gasped as they saw the wreckage. A massive tree had fallen onto a shiny, expensive car. A woman's furious scream pierced the air. "What did you do? This is your fault." The voice belonged to Karen, the head of the HOA, a woman known for making everyone's life miserable with her strict, unreasonable rules. She stood beside the destroyed car, her car. The once perfect vehicle was now crushed under the weight of the fallen tree, the windshield shattered, the roof caved in. It was unrecognizable. But there was one big problem. The tree? It wasn't supposed to be there. And Karen knew that better than anyone. The protagonist stood in silence, staring at the wreckage, unable to believe what he was seeing. That tree, his tree, had been illegally cut down by Karen. And now, nature had just taken its revenge. But instead of admitting the truth, Karen pointed straight at him, her face red with rage. "This is on you. You knew this would happen," she shouted, her voice shaking. The neighbors looked between them, confused. Whispers spread. Was she seriously blaming him for this? The protagonist took a deep breath, trying to control his anger. He had warned her. He had told her the tree was valuable, protected, and important. She didn't care. She had it cut down behind his back, illegally, in secret. And now, because of her actions, her own car had paid the price. But instead of owning up to her mistake, she was doing what she did best, blaming someone else. The protagonist clenched his fists. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because if Karen thought he was going to take the fall for her mistake, she was about to learn a very painful lesson. The wind rustled through the empty space where the tree once stood. A $250,000 tree, gone. The protagonist stood there, fists clenched, as Karen continued her tantrum in front of the ruined car. "This is your fault. You should have taken that tree down yourself," she shrieked. The neighbors exchanged confused glances. One of them, an older man named Mr. Dawson, finally spoke. "But, wasn't it you who ordered the tree to be removed?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Karen's face turned red. "That's not the point," she snapped. "That tree was a hazard." The protagonist let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "That tree stood there for over 100 years, Karen," he said, his voice level. "It was protected by the city. I told you that." Karen folded her arms, lifting her chin stubbornly. "It was an eyesore," she said. "And it was ruining the neighborhood aesthetic." There it was. The real reason. Karen, as head of the HOA, had made it her personal mission to control everything in the neighborhood, down to what color people could paint their front doors. She had always hated the tree. And now it was gone. The protagonist took a deep breath, shaking his head. "You had no right to remove it." Karen smirked. "Well, it's gone now, isn't it?" Her smugness made his blood boil. She really thought she could get away with this. One of the neighbors, a younger woman named Lisa, frowned. "Wait, if the tree was already cut down, then how did it end up here?" Everyone turned toward the wreckage of Karen's crushed car. The branches were thick, the bark fresh. This wasn't just any fallen tree. The protagonist's eyes narrowed. He knew exactly what happened. "When you cut down a tree that big," he said slowly, "you have to remove the stump properly. If you don't, the roots can weaken, and the ground can shift." Karen's smirk faded slightly. "The storm last night must have loosened the stump," the protagonist continued. "And when the roots gave out, the leftover part of the trunk fell. Right onto your car," Mr. Dawson finished. Silence. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but for once, she had no words. Because she knew he was right. The storm wasn't to blame. The protagonist wasn't to blame. Karen had done this to herself. But, of course, Karen would never admit that. Instead, she straightened up and crossed her arms. "This is a violation of HOA safety standards," she said coldly. I'll be issuing you a fine for this mess. A fine. For a tree she cut down. For damage she caused. The protagonist stared at her in disbelief. Was she serious? You're joking, Lisa muttered. I don't joke about HOA policies, Karen snapped. This is negligence on his part. He'll be hearing from the board soon. The protagonist felt a wave of anger rise inside him. She had already stolen his tree. Now she was trying to steal his money, too. Enough was enough. If Karen wanted a fight, she was about to get one. And this time, he wasn't backing down. The morning after the tree disaster, the protagonist woke up to an envelope taped to his door. He didn't even have to open it to know what it was. Another fine from the HOA. He ripped it off the door and scanned the paper. $5,000. Violation, unsafe property conditions resulting in neighborhood hazard, the note read. The sheer audacity of Karen was almost impressive. She had cut down his tree, caused damage to her own car, and now she was trying to charge him for it. Enough was enough. The protagonist grabbed his phone and dialed the HOA office. It went straight to voicemail. Typical. So he decided to handle things himself. After getting dressed, he marched straight to Karen's house, ready to demand some answers. But when he knocked, the door swung open before he even touched it. Karen was already standing there, smirking. I was wondering when you'd show up, she said, folding her arms. You have some nerve, the protagonist shot back, holding up the fine. You think I'm actually going to pay for something you caused? Karen tilted her head, amused. You should have removed that tree when I told you to, she said smoothly. Then none of this would have happened. It was protected, he reminded her. The city had rules you ignored. Karen just shrugged. The HOA has its own rules. And last I checked, I'm the one in charge. The protagonist gritted his teeth. She thought she was untouchable. Well, I hope you enjoy your power trip, he said, turning away. Because this isn't over. Karen chuckled. We'll see. The protagonist stormed back to his house, his mind racing. He needed a plan. And he needed evidence. That night, he installed a security camera facing the front yard. If Karen had done something shady once, she'd do it again. And he was right. 2 nights later, at around 2 a.m., a faint rustling sound woke him up. He grabbed his phone and checked the security camera feed. What he saw made his blood boil. A man in dark clothes was sneaking around his front yard. And he wasn't just walking around. He was pouring something at the base of his plants. The protagonist's heart pounded. Was he poisoning his yard? He grabbed a flashlight and rushed outside. "HEY," he shouted. The man froze, then turned and sprinted down the street. The protagonist chased after him, but the guy was fast. He disappeared into the night. But the protagonist didn't need to catch him. He already had everything recorded. And the best part? When he rewatched the footage, he caught a clear glimpse of the man's face. And he recognized him. It was Karen's landscaper. She was sabotaging his yard. And now, he had proof. Karen thought she was above the rules. But she was about to learn. Some rules can't be broken without consequences. The next morning, the protagonist sat at his kitchen table, staring at the video footage on his phone. There was no doubt about it, the landscaper had been poisoning his plants under Karen's orders. He felt his heart race with both anger and a sense of power. This wasn't just about the tree anymore. This was about protecting his property, his rights, and showing Karen she couldn't get away with her behavior. But first, he needed to confront her. Armed with the footage and his growing evidence, he walked to Karen's house. When he knocked, there was no answer at first. But after a few moments, the door creaked open, and Karen's sharp face appeared, eyes narrowing when she saw him. "What do you want now?" she snapped, clearly irritated. I need to talk to you, the protagonist said, holding up his phone. And I think we need to have a serious conversation. She raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. About what? He pressed play. The video clearly showed the landscaper sneaking around his property, pouring what looked like a toxic substance near his plants. Karen's eyes widened, then quickly narrowed. What is this supposed to be? This, he said, pointing to the screen, is your landscaper. Poisoning my yard. I have all of it recorded. Her face turned a shade paler, but she quickly regained her composure. You have no right to record that. That's an invasion of privacy. You know what's an invasion of privacy, Karen? He shot back. Cutting down my tree without my permission. Poisoning my yard. Karen took a deep breath, trying to maintain her control. You don't have proof I ordered that. The protagonist stepped closer, feeling the weight of his words. I don't need proof. You've made it clear that you'll do anything to get rid of that tree. And you've made my life a living hell since you became the head of the HOA. Karen's eyes flashed with frustration. This is your fault. If you had just listened to me, none of this would have happened. Wrong, the protagonist replied. You've pushed and pushed until you finally crossed a line. And now I'm pushing back. He held up the paperwork for the illegal tree removal, an official document from the city, proving that the tree had been taken down without proper authorization. Your landscaper didn't have a permit to remove the tree. I've already reported it to the city, he said. And now, you're going to have to pay the consequences. Karen's face twisted in disbelief. You think you can make me pay? Not only do I think I can, I'm going to make sure you do, he said firmly. You don't scare me, she said, her voice shaking. I'm the HOA president. I have the power to make your life miserable. Your power is running out, Karen, he said calmly. The city is already investigating. And once they see that you illegally removed my tree, they'll hit you with a hefty fine. Your HOA position will be in jeopardy. Karen stared at him, trying to hold her ground, but something in her eyes told him that she knew he was right. I won't let this go, he added, his voice steady. You're going to pay for what you did to my property, my tree, and my peace of mind. She sneered. We'll see about that. The storm came out of nowhere. The sky turned dark and heavy. Clouds rolled in, thick and gray. The air grew thick with humidity and the scent of rain. It was an ominous sign. The protagonist stood on his porch, watching the winds pick up. He could feel the tension in the air, a feeling like something big was about to happen. And then the rain came, first as a drizzle, then as a torrential downpour. But the storm wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the tree stump. The one that Karen's landscaper had failed to properly remove. The roots, which had been disturbed during the illegal cutting, were unstable, and the storm's heavy winds were now doing what the protagonist had feared. He didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but he had a sinking feeling in his stomach. As the rain lashed down, he heard a strange noise coming from the yard, a creaking sound, like something was giving way. He turned to see the stump shaking, the ground around it shifting. Suddenly, with an ear-splitting crack, a massive branch from a nearby tree broke loose and came crashing down. The branch flew through the air, barely missing a few nearby houses. And then, as if in some twisted bit of fate, it landed directly on Karen's car. The sound of metal crumpling, glass shattering, and tires screeching filled the air. The protagonist froze for a moment, heart racing, as he watched the damage unfold. The car that Karen had so proudly owned, her prized luxury vehicle, was now crushed under the weight of the fallen branch. Neighbors rushed out of their homes, eyes wide with shock. Some immediately started calling for help, others just stood in disbelief. The protagonist didn't move. He knew the damage was bad. Real bad. And Karen was going to have to deal with it. Karen appeared a few minutes later, running out of her front door, with a panicked look on her face. What happened? She screamed, looking around. The protagonist just stood there, his arms crossed. He could feel a small sense of vindication, even though the situation was intense. "This wasn't me," he said calmly. "This is your doing. The tree you had cut down. The roots weren't removed properly, and now this happened." Karen's eyes darted to the wreckage. Her face turned red with fury, and then, without skipping a beat, she turned to him. "You did this. You're the one who ruined my car," she shouted, pointing a trembling finger at him. "Are you serious?" the protagonist shot back. "You had the tree removed illegally. You're the one who caused this." But Karen wasn't listening. She was too busy freaking out over her car, shaking her head in disbelief. "This is unbelievable. You can't do this to me. You'll pay for this." The protagonist felt his anger rising. How could she still be blaming him? "Karen, you cut down my tree," he said, his voice steady but full of frustration. "I warned you about this. You ignored the laws, you made a mess, and now you're blaming me." Karen shrieked in anger, her voice cracking. "You did this. This is all your fault. I'm reporting you to the HOA. You'll regret this." But before she could go any further, a neighbor, Mr. Dawson, stepped forward. "You're not reporting anyone," Mr. Dawson said firmly. "We've all seen the way you've treated him. You've been a nightmare to the whole neighborhood. And frankly, I think the city is going to have some questions for you." Karen froze, her face turning pale. The weight of her actions, the tree removal, the fines, the constant harassment, was starting to sink in. You don't know who you're messing with," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. But the damage was done. As the rain continued to pour, the neighbors exchanged glances. The sympathy for Karen had long since disappeared. The protagonist turned to walk back into his house, but not before giving one final piece of advice to Karen. "Good luck with the insurance claim," he said. "They're not going to cover your car. Not after what you did." He walked inside, feeling a sense of satisfaction. The storm had brought the chaos, but it was Karen's own actions that had caused it. Now, it was only a matter of time before the consequences caught up with her. The storm raged through the neighborhood, relentless and unforgiving. The rain fell in sheets, drowning the streets, the wind howling like an angry beast. But the protagonist stood at his window, watching the aftermath. His thoughts weren't on the storm itself, but on the fallout from Karen's actions. The damage to her car had been devastating. The tree stump and the ground around it had shifted, weakened by the heavy rain, and now a large branch from another tree had fallen right onto her luxury vehicle. But what was even more ironic was that the tree that had caused all this destruction was the very one Karen had illegally removed. As the rain continued to pour down, Karen stood in front of the wreckage of her car, still in disbelief. She was talking frantically on her phone to her insurance company, but the frustration on her face was evident. It had been hours since the tree had fallen on her car, and the longer she spoke with the insurance agent, the more her confidence slipped. From his front window, the protagonist could see Karen's strained conversation. The words she was hearing were becoming more and more clear. The insurance company wasn't covering the damage. At first, she had hoped that the storm would be seen as an act of God, an unpredictable natural disaster. But her hopes quickly dashed when she was told that because the tree had been illegally removed in the first place, the damage wasn't covered under her policy. Karma. And it wasn't just her car that was at risk. Karen's entire property was now in danger. The storm's winds were getting stronger, and her house was starting to feel the pressure. The trees she had so eagerly tried to get rid of were now swaying dangerously. The protagonist glanced at the news on his phone. A warning about falling trees had been issued for the area, as the ground was already saturated and the winds were fierce. It was a matter of time before something else gave way. And the next thing to fall would likely be Karen's home. Karen finally hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, staring at the wreckage in disbelief. Her prized possession, her luxury car, now a pile of twisted metal and shattered glass. But the damage didn't stop there. The HOA board had already been contacted by the city about the illegal removal of the tree, and it wasn't long before they were involved in the growing mess. Karen's actions, cutting down a protected tree without permission, had triggered an investigation. And now, her reputation within the HOA was on the line. The protagonist had already filed a complaint with the city, and soon, he would be submitting evidence to show that Karen's negligence had caused damage not only to his property but to her own. Her position as HOA president was at risk. As the storm continued to batter the neighborhood, Karen's problems grew worse. The winds picked up, and with every gust, a few more branches from nearby trees snapped off, some of them falling perilously close to her house. Around an hour later, the protagonist walked outside, taking in the saturated ground and the thick, misty air. He could feel the weight of everything that had happened. The storm, nature's fury, had revealed something important. Karen's hubris and irresponsibility had led to this. Now, her recklessness was catching up to her, piece by piece. It wasn't just the tree that had fallen, it was her whole life. Her standing in the HOA was no longer secure. The city fines were piling up. And soon, she'd be facing the consequences of her own actions. Back at his own house, the protagonist couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as he watched Karen's situation continue to unravel. He had fought back when she'd tried to bully him into submission. But as the storm continued to rage outside, he knew there was more to come. This wasn't over. And neither was Karen's downfall. Her arrogance, her belief that she was above the rules, had blinded her to the fact that karma had a way of catching up with people like her. But in the end, it wasn't about the car, the tree, or the storm. It was about the lesson that the universe had served up on a silver platter. Everything she had done to him, everything she had tried to destroy, was coming back to haunt her. The days following the storm felt like a blur. The rain eventually stopped, but the damage left behind was undeniable. Karen's car was still crushed under the weight of the fallen branch, and the threat of further damage to her home loomed over her. But her biggest problem wasn't the storm, it was the growing web of consequences surrounding her actions. The protagonist had already submitted all the evidence he had gathered. His security footage showing Karen's landscaper poisoning his plants was a powerful piece of proof. And the city's investigation into the illegal tree cutting was moving quickly. Karen, on the other hand, was still in denial. She had tried to blame the protagonist for the tree falling on her car, but everyone knew the truth. She was the one who had ordered the tree's illegal removal. She had ignored the rules, and now her actions were spiraling out of control. She had hired an expensive lawyer to try and cover up her mistakes, but the more they dug into her background, the more her wrongdoings came to light. The city fined her heavily for removing the tree without a permit, and the HOA board had no choice but to suspend her from her position as president. But even that wasn't enough for Karen. She refused to accept responsibility. As the court date approached, Karen blamed everyone else for her problems, refusing to acknowledge that her own greed and arrogance had caused everything to go wrong. She showed up to the first court hearing with her lawyer, looking defiant, her face a mask of anger and frustration. She stormed into the courtroom, making it clear that she believed she was in the right. "You're all just against me because you don't understand what I was trying to do," Karen shouted at the judge. "I was only trying to make this neighborhood better." The judge raised an eyebrow, but Karen wasn't listening. The protagonist stood in the corner of the room, watching her. He was calm, focused. He had seen her try to control everything around her, but now she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. He had the law on his side. He had the evidence. And more importantly, he had the truth. The courtroom drama escalated as Karen's lawyer tried to spin a story of miscommunication and misunderstanding. But the facts were clear. The tree had been removed without the proper permits, and the damage that had followed was a direct result of her disregard for the rules. But then, just when Karen thought she had a chance to make a last-ditch defense, the judge interrupted her lawyer's arguments. "I've seen enough," the judge said sternly. "It's clear that your actions were reckless and in violation of both city and HOA rules." The courtroom went silent as the judge turned to Karen. You're not only responsible for the damages to the plaintiff's property, the judge continued, but you've also cost this neighborhood time, money, and peace of mind. Your position as HOA president is hereby revoked, and you will be held accountable for the damages caused by your actions. Karen's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. She couldn't even manage a defense. She had lost. The judge looked at the protagonist. You will be compensated for the damages caused by this incident, the judge said. And the fines will be imposed on Ms. Karen for her illegal activities. Karen's lawyer tried to protest, but the judge wasn't having it. The case was closed, and the verdict was final. The following weeks were a blur for Karen. The consequences of her actions hit her like a freight train. The city's fine was massive, and her reputation in the community was shattered. Her house went up for sale as she struggled to pay off the mounting debt. The HOA, which she had once controlled with an iron fist, now found itself moving in a new direction, away from her influence. And the protagonist? He received a large settlement for the damage caused by Karen's illegal actions. It wasn't just about the money, it was about getting justice. He took the money and invested in his future, using it to improve his home, replacing the valuable tree that had been stolen from him. One evening, as he sat on his porch, sipping a drink and enjoying the peace of his property, he reflected on everything that had happened. Karen's downfall had been swift. Her arrogance, greed, and need for control had been her undoing. And now, the neighborhood was finally at peace. The news of Karen's downfall spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Her hoarded power as HOA president was gone, and with it, any remaining influence she had over the community. For years, she had imposed her will on everyone, acting like she could bend the rules to suit her personal agenda. But now, the walls were closing in. The legal and social consequences of her actions were undeniable, and the once powerful HOA president was left holding the pieces of her crumbling life. After the court hearing, Karen's lawyer had done his best to try and help her, but the evidence was overwhelming. The illegal removal of the tree, the poisoning of the protagonist's plants, the mounting fines, all of it was too much to ignore. The city imposed a massive fine, which Karen could not afford. Her once perfect credit was ruined. Her neighbors, who had once been too afraid to stand up to her, now felt empowered. They knew the truth, and it wasn't long before Karen's own actions alienated her from everyone who had once supported her. The HOA board, after seeing how Karen had abused her position, fired her. The new president, a much more reasonable figure, promised to change the rules and make the neighborhood a place of cooperation rather than conflict. Karen's house, once a symbol of her authority, was put up for sale. No one wanted to buy it. The word was out, she had tried to bend the rules, manipulate the law, and hurt her neighbors. The damage was done, and she was no longer the powerful figure she had once been. The protagonist, on the other hand, had done what seemed impossible. He had stood up to Karen and won. His patience, his careful gathering of evidence, and his unwillingness to back down had paid off. His house was more peaceful now. The neighborhood had returned to normal, without the shadow of Karen's oppressive rules hanging over it. Neighbors spoke to each other again, shared stories, and helped one another. There were no more unexpected fines, no more threats of legal action for minor infractions. It was a community once again. One afternoon, as the protagonist was tending to his new tree, he spotted Mr. Dawson walking by. The older man smiled and waved. "Everything all right?" Mr. Dawson asked. "Better than ever," the protagonist replied with a grin. "Thanks to you and everyone else who finally stood up to her." "Well, someone had to," Mr. Dawson chuckled. "You were the one who really took the first step. I think a lot of us were afraid of her for too long." The protagonist nodded. "I wasn't going to let her ruin everything I've worked for. I had to fight back." Mr. Dawson stopped, looking at the young tree the protagonist had planted. "Looks like she wasn't the only one who needed to plant something new, huh?" The protagonist smiled. "Yeah, I guess we all did." It was true. In a way, the tree wasn't just a symbol of the past being replaced, it was also a symbol of the future. A future where the community could thrive, where people didn't have to live in fear of one person's selfishness and greed. As the days went by, Karen's name slowly disappeared from the neighborhood conversation. People had long forgotten the chaos she caused, and now they could focus on the positive changes that had come in her wake. One evening, the protagonist sat on his porch, watching the sunset. The tree, still young but full of promise, stood tall in his yard, a reminder of everything he had fought for. He thought about how far he had come, how he had taken on the system, stood up to a powerful, vindictive woman, and come out victorious. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments when he wasn't sure if he could keep going, when the pressure from Karen and the HOA seemed too much to handle. But he had kept going. He had learned that no one is above the law, and no one should be allowed to use their power to harm others. Karen had tried to take what wasn't hers, but in the end, her actions had destroyed her, not just her car or the tree, but her whole life. In the silence of the evening, the protagonist found peace in knowing that he had stood his ground, and that justice had been served. The neighborhood was quieter now. The constant tension that Karen had created was gone. The protagonist could finally take a deep breath, knowing that peace had returned. The once overbearing HOA president was a thing of the past, and the new leadership was fair, honest, and focused on community over control. As the months passed, Karen's house sat empty, the for sale sign still hanging out front. No one came to buy it, not after everything that had happened. Word had spread, the woman who tried to control the neighborhood had lost everything. She was now a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power is abused and greed outweighs reason. The protagonist had won the battle, but it hadn't been easy. It had taken time, effort, and courage to stand up to someone like Karen. There were days when he felt like giving up, days when her threats and the pressure from the HOA made him question his choices. But in the end, it was his patience and persistence that paid off. One morning, he woke up early and went outside to check on the new tree he had planted. It was growing steadily, its branches starting to stretch toward the sky. He could see the potential in it, just as he saw potential in the neighborhood that had been so affected by Karen's greed. The protagonist smiled to himself. It's funny, he thought, how something as simple as a tree can teach you a lesson about life. He thought back to the early days, before everything had exploded. He had been just a homeowner, trying to live in peace, when Karen had started making his life miserable. Her threats, the fines, the harassment, it had all seemed overwhelming. But he had stood his ground. And in the end, he had won. The tree, now a young symbol of his victory, was a reminder of how important it is to stand up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. The sacrifices had been real, but the reward was more than worth it. Karen's life had been shattered because of her refusal to follow the rules. Her greed, her need for control, her disregard for others, they had all come back to haunt her. The universe, nature itself, had delivered a form of instant karma. The protagonist thought about the lessons he had learned. Patience, sometimes the best thing to do is not rush into a fight, but to wait for the right moment to act. Justice, in the end, the truth always prevails, no matter how much someone tries to hide it. Strength, true strength isn't about power, it's about standing firm in the face of adversity and doing the right thing, even when it's hard. He had stood up to Karen, not out of spite, but because it was the right thing to do. He hadn't just fought for his tree or his property, he had fought for the principles of fairness and justice that had been violated by someone who thought they were above the law. As the sun rose over the horizon, casting a golden glow on the neighborhood, the protagonist felt at peace. He had done what was right, and the community was better for it. He was better for it. Looking over at the new tree, he thought, I didn't just fight for my rights. I fought for all of us. The neighborhood was a stronger place now, one where people knew they could stand up for themselves without fear. The cycle of abuse and control had been broken. And while Karen's fate was sealed, the protagonist had learned a valuable lesson, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Life wasn't about power. It was about doing what's right, even when it's the hardest thing to do. And in the end, the right thing always prevails.